All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Josh Stearns. Josh is a campaign director at Free Press, which you can find at freepress.net. He is also on the board of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. You can follow him on Twitter at JC Stearns. Josh, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Matt.
All right, so Josh, you recently wrote a really interesting new report for Free Press on the state of journalism in the digital age. Why don't you lay it out for us? What is it all about?
Sure. One of the big issues that keeps coming up, whether it was the journalist arrests that were happening around the Occupy protests or the recent SHIELD law moving through Congress right now, is how do we define who's a journalist? And my argument in this paper is that that's the wrong question. We need to be asking, how can we defend and protect all acts of journalism? But to do that, we need to figure out what acts of journalism really means. So what my research does is goes through the legal foundation and case law, as well as the statements of journalism organizations and others, to show that there's a growing consensus around protecting everybody who's participating in the journalism process, and then figuring out exactly how we can define what that looks like.
Well, let's go into some of the details, because you talk about there's some cases where it's pretty obvious that a person who doesn't have journalism credentials was clearly creating an act of journalism. So tell us a little about some of the cases and how actually they should be protected.
Yeah, so a great example of this is when you say an act of journalism, I think it raises question marks for people to understand how the whole journalism landscape is changing, and that more and more people are participating either as news distributors, sharing things on Facebook, news consumers, which we've long done, and then news producers, whether it's on their own blog or actually participating with a crowdsourced project at a main news organization. And so there's lots of different ways that people are engaging. I'd lay out a couple examples, pulled both from recent past as well as a little bit longer history. But one that I always go back to is Karina Vargas, who was 19 when she was riding home on her way home in Oakland, and she got off at the Fruitvale station in Oakland and saw police really roughing up some kids. She pulled out her cell phone and started recording. And when things got really serious, instead of walking away, which is what most people do, she actually walked towards what was going on, to the point where she was just like 15 feet away when police shot Oscar Grant in the back. So she's the one who actually got on tape the shooting of Oscar Grant in the back, which was later used by news organizations. It was used in the court, and it was clearly an act of journalism where she saw something important that was deeply in the public interest, and she walked towards the danger and kept recording. So in situations like that, she was threatened by police immediately after that, who wanted to take her camera and actually confiscate that footage for obvious reasons. And she refused, and she stepped back on the train and she got away with her footage. And so we've seen this over and over again with people recording in public places police activities and then being threatened by police. And so we've worked really hard to make sure all people's right to record, as protected by the First Amendment, is protected also in current law and practice.
I mean, so right now, in the case of Karina, like, is there? I mean, to me, it's fairly straightforward constitutionally speaking, but is there any current laws that are on the books that would actually threaten what she actually recorded and protect what she actually did?
Well, the problem is that all across the U.S. there's different state laws that revolve around things like eavesdropping and whether there's mutual consent for being recorded. And it gets really confusing about where the lines are around that stuff. But again and again and again in the courts, anytime these cases come up, the recording of police in public places has been widely protected under the First Amendment, because the First Amendment gives all of us the right to gather and disseminate news. And so I think that's really important to see that as technology changes and as the people who are using that technology change, just because we don't have a printing press doesn't mean we don't have a right to gather and distribute news.
Yeah, none of us really have those printing presses anymore.
That's
it's
right.
a new era here. Let's talk about a couple other aspects that you cover here. One is actually Jersey Shore hurricane news. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you remember, but not too long ago, a senator wrote how we need to have a SHIELD law, but it can't just protect anybody who uses Twitter or Facebook, because not everyone who uses Twitter and Facebook is a journalist. And the point is not that everyone who uses those platforms are journalists, but that journalism can and does happen on those platforms all the time. So just to write it off as that's not journalism is incredibly dangerous. And a great example of that is Jersey Shore Hurricane News, which is run by a guy, Justin Ocello, who's an urban planner by trade and has no journalism training or experience or background. But he saw a huge need in his community to cover what was happening around the hurricanes that have hit the Jersey Shore recently and all of the fallout and recovery from that. And very quickly, his site became the hub for news and information. It's the place where communities went to not only to get informed, but also to have conversations about what was happening in their community. And before long, he had more followers on Facebook than WNYC and ProPublica combined. And the thing is, his news organization only exists on Facebook. So he does all of his writing, all of his reporting, and all of his conversation with the community there on Facebook. So he's one of these new people who's using new platforms to publish critical, vital information about his community, so much so that the White House even recognized the important role he played during the recent hurricanes. And that is the kind of thing that we need to protect, even though it doesn't look like traditional journalism, doesn't sound like traditional journalism. He's doing incredible journalism.
Yeah, I mean, you can't look at that and not say that that is journalism, and not even just journalism that actually saved lives and actually really did help those people on the Jersey Shore when when it was just a massive crisis going on, where lives were threatened, where property was threatened and destroyed. There's no doubt that what he did was of massive journalistic value. Let's move on to another one that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're in New Jersey. Let's go down to the south to Tulsa. What happened in Tulsa?
Well, that's a really interesting story because this doesn't so much involve new platforms for journalism as much as new players. And so this is a great example of how, regardless of what platform you use, more people are taking part in journalism. This is a guy named Leroy Chapman, and he was an amateur historian in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who just really had a passion for history. And he started following and digging into a story that none of the mainstream media around Oklahoma would touch, and that was the history of the founder of Tulsa, Tate Brady. So this guy, Leroy Chapman, followed the story from Oklahoma to New York City, digging into public records, sifting through documents in basements, and he uncovered this terrible history of violence and racism that surrounded this guy, Tate Brady, a guy who was always held up as the pinnacle of the founder of Tulsa, the person who made Tulsa possible. And now all of a sudden this dark history is uncovered by a citizen journalist. And luckily there was a journalism startup in Oklahoma called This Land Press that believed in what he was doing and actually published his reporting. And it was the first time this guy had ever been published. He didn't come to this through a journalistic background, but the work he did was trustworthy, was about holding people accountable, and was the kind of journalism that we need more of. And that came from a citizen, and that needs to be protected.